She walked for 6 hours before she stopped moving. Not because she found somewhere to go, because her legs gave out on a concrete divider beside an overpass on the north end of the city. And she sat down hard and just stayed there, backpack between her feet, phone at 4% battery, $63 in her front pocket, and the particular silence of a person who has been strong for so long that the silence itself starts to feel like a warning. She ate half a granola bar she'd been saving since Tuesday. She drank water from the bottle she refilled at every gas station she passed. She opened her mother's notebook to the last page with writing on it her mother's handwriting. Clinical and fast, notes from a training seminar on pediatric airway management. And she didn't read it, just held it. The way you hold something that belonged to someone else and can't quite make yourself put down. She thought about Caleb. Not about what she'd done. She didn't need to revisit the mechanics of it. Didn't need to replay the sequence. She thought about the moment his pulse came back. That specific moment, the faint, erratic beat returning under her fingers. Unmistakable once you knew what you were feeling for. She thought about the way he'd looked at her earlier, when she'd told him her mother was the smartest person she'd ever known. He hadn't offered empty comfort. He hadn't said something reflexive about how she must be proud, or how her mother would be proud of her. He just looked at her with those gray-green eyes and taken it in, the way a person does when they understand that grief doesn't need decoration. She hoped he was all right. Then she put the notebook away, re-zipped the backpack, and tried to figure out her next move with what little charge remained in her phone and whatever was left of her ability to think straight. She didn't have many options. The shelter on 6th had a 60-day wait list. The church that ran Tuesday dinners didn't open until 5 the following evening. The overpass was dry and relatively protected, and she had slept in worse places, though not by much. She decided on the overpass. She found a flat section of ground, used the backpack as a cushion, and lay down on her side facing the wall. The way she'd learned to not to be dramatic about it, just because it was warmer to have your back against something solid, and because facing the wall meant you could hear anything approaching from behind without having to see it coming. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. At St. Michael's Hospital, Caleb Bear Maddox opened his eyes at 10 minutes past 9 in the evening. The first thing he was aware of was the ceiling. Then the sound of the monitor beside him, the soft, rhythmic confirmation that his heart was still maintaining an agreement with the rest of his body. Then the faces his wife, Linda, gripping his hand with both of hers, her expression in that particular state of controlled relief that people wear when they've been terrified for hours and are only now beginning to believe the worst has passed. Beside her stood Grizz, whose real name was Mason Cole, who had ridden with Bear for 26 years, and whose face at that moment looked the same way it had looked when they were younger men and Bear had taken a bad slide on a wet highway and come up limping but alive. "You scared the hell out of me," Linda said, and her voice broke on the last word. "I know," he squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry. Don't you dare apologize. Just don't do it again." He tried to move, and the entire left side of his chest reminded him why he was horizontal. He stayed still. The doctor had come and gone by the time he was fully coherent, massive myocardial infarction. The widowmaker, they called it, the kind with a survival rate low enough that the number was not something people discussed cheerfully. He'd been told the specific statistic in a tone that made clear the medical staff found his continued existence somewhat remarkable. He already knew why he was alive. He'd been conscious enough, in those last moments before everything went dark, to feel it, the compression sequence, steady and exact, not panicked, not tentative, done by someone who knew what they were doing and refused to stop doing it. He'd registered it the way you register something in a dream that feels more real than the dream itself. He asked the night nurse about her at 11:15. He asked, by description blonde, young 20s, the waitress at the diner. The nurse didn't know. He asked the attending physician the same question when she came for her midnight rounds. She didn't know either, but she told him that the paramedic report cited a bystander who had run compressions for approximately 9 minutes and provided a full verbal handoff on arrival. She kept good count, the physician said. In cardiac cases like yours, that's often the difference. Bear was quiet for a moment. Find out who she was, he said to Grizz. Not a request. Factual. Grizz nodded. Already working on it, and find out if she's all right. Something in Grizz's expression shifted, barely perceptible to anyone who didn't know him, but Bear had known him for over 2 decades. Tell me, Bear said. They fired her, Grizz said. The owner of the diner fired her before the ambulance cleared the parking lot. Near as I can find out, she walked out the back with her bag, and nobody knows where she went. The monitor beside the bed registered a spike that brought a nurse to the doorway. Bear looked at the ceiling. He breathed slowly, the deliberate, effortful breathing of a man managing himself because he understood that his heart had been through enough today, and the anger currently moving through him was not going to help it. She was living there, Linda said quietly. She'd done her own calls while Grizz was making his. Not in the diner, but in the storage room, part-time. Kept her belongings there. From what I can find out, she doesn't have a permanent address. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. She saved my life, Bear said. And then that man threw her out on the street. Neither Linda nor Grizz offered anything in response to that. There was nothing useful to add. Bear looked at Grizz. I need you to find her, I know. Listen to me, Grizz. Not to make a show of it. Not to pull up in force and make her feel like she's in the middle of something she didn't ask to be in the middle of. Find her, make sure she's safe. Find out what she actually needs. And tell her that someone wants to say thank you in a way she can use. Grizz looked at him steadily. That's going to take some doing. If she's street smart, she'll be hard to locate. She kept a man alive for 9 minutes on a diner floor. With no equipment, Bear said. She's more than street smart. That's not an insult. I'm telling you to respect it when you find her. Don't walk up to her like you're doing her a favor. Walk up to her like she already did one for you. Grizz stood. He put his hand on Bear's shoulder for exactly 2 seconds, the full extent of demonstrative affection between men who had ridden together for most of their adult lives, and then he walked out of the hospital room. The message went out at 1:47 in the morning. It was not long. Bear had insisted on simple. Grizz sent it to the regional network, chapter by chapter, and the language was stripped of any drama. A young woman, 20s blonde, name of Haley Monroe, was last seen leaving Red Mesa Diner on foot Thursday afternoon. She is owed a debt. Find her. Make sure she is safe. Report back. Do not approach without Grizz present, and do not make it into anything larger than what it is. What Grizz had underestimated was what Bear meant to the network. In the rooms where the message landed, in the chapter, houses and garages and back offices from Phoenix to Albuquerque to Las Vegas to the California chapters that maintain ties with Arizona, the name Caleb Maddox carried the specific weight of someone who had been present and dependable for nearly 3 decades. Not famous in the way that outsiders sometimes imagine members of that world to be famous. Something quieter than that. The kind of reputation built one action at a time over years, never performative, never borrowed. The kind you couldn't manufacture. When those rooms learned that Bear had nearly died on a diner floor and that the person who kept him alive had been thrown out into the street for doing it, the response was not chaotic. It was methodical. People began making calls, checking in, asking which direction and when to move. It was not a mobilization for violence. Anyone who knew Bear understood that was not what he'd asked for. And what he hadn't asked for, his people didn't do. It was something harder to describe, but easier to recognize. A collective decision made simultaneously across hundreds of people that this was a situation requiring their presence. By 4 in the morning, the first bikes were heading toward Tucson. Haley was awake by 5:30. She'd slept in pieces, the light sleep of someone always partially monitoring their environment, and by the time the pre-dawn started pulling gray into the sky above the overpass, she was sitting up with the notebook open, not writing, just thinking. She spent the first hour of light running her situation mathematically. $63. She could make it stretch 4, maybe 5 days if she was careful, longer if she found a food bank with short lines. The church opened tonight. She could ask about the shelter. Wait list again. Sometimes people dropped off the list. Sometimes slots opened. She could try the temp agency on Oracle Road, the one that occasionally had day labor kitchen work, though she'd have to explain why she was no longer at the diner. And the story would sound the way it always sounded when an employer fired someone for something that made the employer look bad. She thought about applying to the hospital. Not as a nurse, she didn't have the credentials, but as a support staff position. Orderly, transport, supply room work. She'd been in enough medical spaces, secondhand, to know that hospitals ran on people who weren't doctors or nurses. People who did the physical work that kept everything else moving. She could do that. She had the thought, and then she had the thought underneath it, that she'd need an address for the application and a letter of reference, and she had neither, and that the address she'd used before was no longer viable because Warren knew about it now. The thing about survival was that every option you identified had a wall at the end of it, and you had to be willing to look at the wall clearly and then find the door in it without pretending the wall wasn't there. She was good at that. She'd gotten very good at that. Her phone was dead. She packed the backpack, stood up, stretched her back, and walked toward the sound of traffic. There was a gas station 2 blocks east that opened at 6. She knew the overnight attendant slightly, an older man named Dennis who had a bad knee and a habit of leaving the door to the staff bathroom unlocked after his shift because the district manager had once declined to give him a key, and he decided. That was a character flaw in the district manager rather than a policy to observe. She could charge her phone there and use the bathroom and figure out the next step. She was 2 blocks from the gas station when the first motorcycle passed her. She didn't look up. Motorcycles were part of the ambient sound of Tucson. She kept walking. The second one passed slower. The third one slowed and then continued. By the time she reached the gas station, there were 4 motorcycles parked outside it. She stopped. The men sitting on them were not threatening in their posture. That was the first thing she registered, because threat posture was something she could read, had learned to read, the position of shoulders, and the direction of eyes, and the particular stillness that meant someone was coiled. These 4 were not coiled. They were watchful, but their hands were visible and easy, and their attention, when it landed on her, was more like recognition than predation. One of them, a man in his 40s with a graying beard and the kind of calm that suggested he'd spent a long time learning how to project it, raised his chin slightly in her direction and said, "Haley Monroe?" She stopped. She didn't answer immediately. In her experience, the correct response to someone knowing your name when you hadn't given it was not immediate confirmation. "Depends on who's asking," she said. "Name's Garcia. I ride with an Arizona chapter." He said it simply, "No display. We're not here to trouble you. Bear Maddox is alive because of you. Word got out that you needed to be found." She kept her distance. Her backpack straps were both on, which was her default when she was ready to move fast if she needed to. "I don't know anyone named Bear Maddox. You know him as Caleb." Something moved in her chest. "How is he?" "Stable. He'll need recovery time, but he's going to make it." Garcia's voice was factual, not performative. "He woke up last night, and the first thing he wanted to know was whether you were all right." She looked at him for a long moment. At all 4 of them, the line of faces, reading them the way her mother had taught her, looking for the thing that didn't match. She didn't find it. These were not men pretending to feel something. She'd spent enough time around people pretending to feel things. Warren. Various shelter supervisors, shelter supervise. The landlord who'd evicted her mother's apartment while she was still sorting through the belongings to know the difference. "I'm all right," she said. "He wants to tell you that himself. He asked us to find you and make sure of it." Garcia paused. "He also said to tell you this isn't a debt collection. He's not trying to pull you into anything you didn't sign up for." His words were, "Find her and ask what she needs." The phrasing landed on her with a precision she hadn't expected. Ask what she needs. Not tell her what she's getting. Not announce what they decided to give. Ask. She adjusted her backpack straps. Tell him I said I'm glad he's alive. You could tell him yourself. He's at St. Michael's. She looked at the gas station door. I need to charge my phone first, she said, which was practical and true, and also, she recognized a way of not saying yes immediately because she had a reflex around powerful people showing up to help her, and that reflex said, be careful, that it was important to understand the terms before you accepted anything, that looking like you needed too much, too fast gave people leverage, and she was finished being leveraged. Garcia nodded. Take your time. He said it like he meant it. She charged her phone for 40 minutes. She used the bathroom. She stood at the window and watched the street, where the 4 bikes had been joined by 2 more, and where she could see, down the block, a 3rd cluster of motorcycles pulling in from the main road. Something was happening. She could feel it. The way you feel a change in pressure, not dramatic, not sudden, but accumulating. The sound of engines had been sporadic since she'd woken up. Now it was becoming something else, more frequent, more deliberate. She went back outside. How many people know? She asked Garcia. He considered his answer. The message went out last night. Bear's got contacts across 4 states. He sent out a message to find me, to find you and make sure you were safe. He paused. He's Bear, Haley. People who ride with him, people who've known him, they take that seriously. She thought about the $63 in her pocket. She thought about the job application she'd been composing in her head. The one she couldn't submit without an address, the one she couldn't finish without a reference. She thought about her mother's notebook and the way her mother used to come home from long shifts and sit at the kitchen table and say that the hardest thing about the job wasn't the emergencies. The hardest thing was watching people fall through cracks that didn't have to exist. She said, I don't want charity. Okay, Garcia said. I mean that. I'm not saying it to sound independent. I'm saying it because the last 4 times someone offered to help me, there were conditions attached that made the help worse than the problem. Okay, he said again. Same tone. Not defensive, not trying to talk her out of it. If Bear wants to say thank you, I'll hear that. But I don't need to be rescued. I need a job in a room and the chance to earn my EMT certification. Those are specific things. I can work for them. I just need someone to not slam the door in my face because I don't have a permanent mailing address. Garcia was quiet for a moment. Then he said, those are very specific things. I know what I need, she said. I've been thinking about it for 8 months. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between respect and something more personal. Some resonance she didn't have the context to understand yet. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. She heard one side of it. Garcia said, she's good. She's standing in front of me. A pause. She says she doesn't want charity. She wants a job and a room and a shot at her EMT. Another pause. Longer. Garcia's expression changed. He lowered the phone and held it out toward her. He wants to talk to you. She took the phone. The voice on the other end was different from what she'd heard in the diner. Quieter, slower, the specific pace of a man who had just been told by his body that it had limits. But the steadiness was the same. Haley, Bear said. Caleb, she said. A pause. She thought she heard something shift in it. The small adjustment of a man recalibrating. They told me what Warren did. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. Maybe not. But you saved my life and got punished for it. That matters to me. She looked at the sky. The day was coming up bright and relentless the way Tucson days did. I'm glad you're alive, she said. That's not a bargaining position. I would have done it for anyone. I know, he said. That's exactly why I want to do something real for you. Not a check, not a handout. You told Garcia what you actually need. I can make those things available to you, honestly, with no conditions. The work would be real work. The pay would be fair. The room would be a place nobody can take from you while you sleep. She thought about the supply room and the $40 storage fee. 30-day trial, she said. I prove I can do the work, or I walk. 30-day trial, he agreed. I'm not going to carry you. I don't think you'd let me. No, she said. I wouldn't. Another pause. How's your back? Running compressions on a man my size for 9 minutes. I'm fine, she said. And then, because it was true, and she thought He'd appreciate accuracy over courtesy. My wrists hurt. Bear laughed, and it clearly hurt him to laugh. And she heard him managing it. And despite everything, despite the overpass, and the $63, and the dead phone, and the 8 months, and all the walls, with no doors that she'd been navigating alone, she laughed too. Briefly, and it surprised her. "Get some food," he said. "Garcia will make sure you get to wherever you need to be. I'll be out of here in a few days, and then we'll talk properly." She handed the phone back to Garcia. He was looking at her. "You all right?" "I'm hungry," she said. He nodded. "I know a place." The motorcycles kept arriving. Through the morning, as Garcia drove Haley to a diner across town, not Red Mesa, a different place, quieter, where nobody looked at her like a problem to be managed, the engines continued to gather. She could hear them from the table by the window. She watched 2 more bikes roll past on the main road, and then 3, and then a line of 7, moving in the same direction. "Where are they going?" she asked. Garcia looked at his coffee. "Red Mesa." She set down her fork. "Bear didn't ask for that," Garcia said. Before she could speak, "He asked for you to be found and for you to be taken care of. The rest of this," he paused, chose his words, "the rest of this is people deciding for themselves what they think about a woman who saved someone's life and lost everything for doing it." She looked at him steadily. "I don't want anyone hurting Warren. Nobody's going to hurt Warren. I mean it. Nobody's going to hurt him," Garcia said again. And his voice had the quality of a statement, not an assurance. "You have my word, and mine matters." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she picked up her fork. She ate the whole plate. She hadn't done that in 3 days. Outside, the engines were getting louder. Not threatening, not angry, or at least not performing anger the way anger usually performed. Just present and accumulating and moving towards something. She thought about Caleb lying in a hospital bed, asking whether she was all right before he asked about anything else. She thought about her mother sitting at the kitchen table, saying the hardest thing wasn't the emergencies. She thought about the fact that for the first time in 8 months, she had eaten a full meal at a table with a chair that didn't wobble, and that someone had paid for it without attaching a condition, and that 300 miles of engines were converging on a town where people had trained themselves to look past her, and she didn't know yet what would come of any of it. But she knew she was still here, still counting, still deciding what the next door looked like and how to find it. That had always been enough to get to the next day. She was beginning to think, just barely, carefully, that it might become something more. Garcia drove her to Iron Haven that afternoon. She didn't ask for a tour. She didn't ask for an introduction. She walked in through the side door he pointed her toward, looked at the space the way her mother had taught her to look at any new environment cataloging, assessing, understanding what was actually there rather than what she'd been told to expect. And within 40 minutes, she had identified 3 things that needed immediate attention: a brake line that had been incorrectly bled, a toolkit that hadn't been properly organized since sometime in the previous quarter, and a first aid cabinet with 2 expired epinephrine auto-injectors and a blood pressure cuff that read 15 points high. She reported the brake line to the senior mechanic on duty, a quiet, broad man named Roy, who had the weathered patience of someone who had spent 30 years doing physical work and had long since stopped needing anyone's approval. He looked at her, looked at the brake line, looked back at her. "You want to show me?" he said. She showed him. He didn't say she was right out loud. He just corrected it without argument, which told her everything she needed to know about Roy. She told the shop manager about the first aid cabinet. He looked mildly startled. The way people look when they realize something they should have caught has been sitting unaddressed in plain sight. He told her to make a list of what needed replacing. She already had. Nobody gave her a welcome speech. Nobody sat her down and explained the culture or the expectations or what Iron Haven meant to the community. She preferred it that way. Speeches were for people who needed convincing. She needed work. She started the following morning at 7 a.m. The 30-day trial had a shape she understood quickly. She was not being tested on whether she could be pleasant or whether she showed up on time or whether she got along with people who weren't immediately sure about her. She was being tested on whether she could do the actual work, the grinding, specific technical work of keeping motorcycles in functional condition and keeping the people around her safe while doing it. Those were tests she knew how to pass. What she hadn't anticipated was the resistance. It came from two directions, and for different reasons. The first direction was a mechanic named Derek, 30s, fast with his hands and slow with his opinions, who made it clear within the first week that theory about why she was there and that his theory had nothing to do with her qualifications. He didn't say it directly. Direct would have been easier to address. He said it in the way he talked around her to Roy during handoffs, in the way he double-checked her work with an attention he didn't apply to anyone else's, in the specific tone he used when he said things like, "That's an interesting approach about a repair she'd made correctly and efficiently." The second direction was subtler and in some ways more disorienting. Several of the older regulars, veterans, retirees, men who used Iron Haven as a gathering place as much as a garage, had heard the story of what she'd done. Some of them were grateful in a way that had no room in it for her to be a full person. They saw the headline version, the homeless girl who saved Bear's life. They wanted to take care of her the way you take care of a symbol. They offered things constantly: coffee, food, rides, small money, with a generosity that was entirely real and entirely suffocating, because embedded in it was the assumption that she was still in crisis, still the girl on the floor of the diner, still one bad decision away from collapse. She understood both reactions. Neither made her angry, not exactly. But she was precise about what she needed from this place, and neither of those reactions was it. Bear called her on her 5th day. He was still at home, recovering. Linda keeping a careful eye on the pace of his movement and the intensity of his conversations. And his calls were brief for that reason. But he called every day. Not to check on the work, he had Roy for that, but to check on her. And she'd learned quickly that his version of checking on her was not asking if she was okay. His version was asking specific questions. What did you fix today? What did you learn? What went wrong and how did you address it? She told him about Derek. Bear was quiet for a moment. You want me to say something to him? No, she said. I want to earn him out of it. Is that possible? With Derek? Yes. A pause. It'll take longer than it should. I have time. You want advice? Yes, she said. Because she actually did, which was different from needing someone to rescue her. Don't perform for him, Bear said. Don't do extra to prove yourself to Derek specifically. He'll smell that and it'll confirm his theory. Just do the work. Do it right. Do it consistently, and let Roy be the one who notices first. Roy's opinion is the one Derek actually trusts. She thought about that. Why Roy? Because Roy doesn't give compliments as social currency. When he says something is good, it's because it's good. Derek knows that. She filed the advice carefully, the way she filed everything useful. How are you feeling? Better than I deserve, according to Linda. According to the statistics, she's probably right. He laughed. The careful version of a laugh that didn't strain his chest too much. I'll be back in the shop in 2 weeks, maybe 3. Take 4, she said. A pause. You giving me medical advice now? I'm giving you statistical advice. The first 6 weeks post-myocardial infarction are when reinfarction risk is highest, and men your age consistently underestimate recovery time because they equate rest with weakness and it kills them. Silence on the line. Your mother teach you that? Bear said, finally. She said it every time one of her patients walked out of a hospital too early. Haley paused. She said men were the worst about it. She wasn't wrong. He said it with the specific humility of a man who had just become evidence supporting her point. I'll talk to Linda about 4 weeks. Good. The twist came on a Tuesday, 2.5 weeks into her trial. It came in the form of a police officer who walked into Iron Haven at 3 in the afternoon, while Haley had her arms elbow deep in a disassembled carburetor. He was young, maybe 28, with the demeanor of someone who hadn't yet decided whether he was comfortable with the authority his uniform gave him. He asked for Haley Monroe. Roy pointed him toward her without expression. The officer said he was following up on a complaint filed by Warren Pike, owner of Red Mesa Diner, alleging that Haley Monroe had on or around the date of her employment taken approximately $340 from the office of the establishment without authorization. She took a slow breath. She wiped her hands on a shop rag. She looked at the officer steadily. "That complaint is false," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I'm just required to—" "When was the money supposedly taken?" He consulted his notes. "The complaint identifies the day of the incident with the cardiac patient. The day I was performing CPR on a man having a heart attack," she said. "The day I was never more than 6 feet from that patient for 23 consecutive minutes. The day Warren Pike himself was standing 12 feet away watching me for most of that time." The officer was writing. His pen had slowed. "The diner has cameras," she said, "interior and exterior. If the money went missing on that day, the footage will show whether I ever entered Warren's office. It will also show how many feet I was from a dying man for the entire duration of the emergency. You should request that footage." "I can do that. You should do it before this complaint goes any further," she said. "Because if you don't, and this becomes a formal charge, I'll be requesting it myself, and the footage is going to raise additional questions about Warren Pike's conduct during that emergency that I suspect he does not want on record." The officer stopped writing. He looked at her. "I'm not being difficult," she said. "I'm being specific. There's a difference." He left without arresting anyone. He also left looking like a man who had arrived expecting a routine follow-up and had ended up somewhere considerably more complicated. Roy walked over after he cleared the door. "You handled that," Roy said. "I know what I did and didn't do," she said. She put her hands back in the carburetor. They were shaking slightly, the specific tremor of adrenaline moving through a body that's been holding very still, but she didn't stop working. Roy stood beside her for a moment. "Derek was watching," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "I know. She called Bear that night." He answered on the second ring. She told him about the officer, the complaint, the footage she'd told the officer to request. She told him flat and factual, the way she always did. When she finished, Bear was quiet long enough that she started to wonder if the call had dropped. Then he said, "Warren filed that complaint the same week you started here." She absorbed that. "He waited to see if the trial was going to work out first. That's what I think. He waited to see if I had something to lose before he tried to take it." "Yes." She sat on the edge of her cot in the small room above the garage, not a handout. $400 a month docked directly from her wages. Her name on a rental agreement she'd read 3 times before signing, and she thought about Warren Pike sitting in his diner, calculating the exact moment when destroying her would cost the most. She thought about how precisely he'd understood what leverage meant. "He thinks I don't have anything to fight back with," she said. "He thinks because I came in with nothing, I'm still nothing." "He's wrong," Bear said. "I know." She said it without bravado, a statement of fact, the same as any other. "I just wanted you to know it happened. I didn't want you to hear it from someone else first. Haley." His voice had dropped to the register he used when he was saying something he meant at the level below regular conversation. "What he's doing isn't just about you. You know that." "I know. He exploited other employees the same way. The housing fee, the fake deductions. I wasn't the first. There are other people who went through what you went through there. People who didn't have anyone to call after. Some of them are still afraid to talk." She thought about the way Warren had looked at her when he found her backpack in the supply room. The flat, assessing look of a man determining how much fear he could extract from a single human being. "If they'll talk," she said, "they should talk. Not for me, for themselves. That's what I think too. But I'm not going to be the reason they feel like they have to. That needs to be their choice." "Agreed," Bear said. "And then, after a moment, there's a woman named Samantha Reed. She still works at Red Mesa. She reached out to Grizz 2 days ago. She says she has something." Haley's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "What kind of something?" "Security footage from the day of the cardiac event." She kept a copy. The carburetor she'd been mentally reassembling in her head while they talked went still. She replayed Warren's order, "Step back. Let the ambulance handle it." His hand on her shoulder, his voice flat and insistent, while Caleb was dying on the floor. "The footage shows him telling me to stop compressions," she said slowly. "She says it shows everything." The silence between them had a different texture now. "Then Warren isn't just trying to get me fired," Haley said. "He's trying to get ahead of what that footage shows about him." "That's what I think," Bear said. "And that means this isn't going to stay small." She lay back on the cot and looked at the ceiling, her mother's notebook on the shelf above her, the sound of the garage quiet and settled below her. She thought about the kind of person Warren was, the kind who had been doing this for years because he'd found a supply of people the world wasn't paying attention to, and who had understood that invisibility was the best protection a predator could ask for. She thought about all the people who had walked out of Red Mesa's back door before her, alone, without anyone sending 300 motorcycles in the dark to find out if they were okay. "What does the city licensing board do with complaints about employer conduct?" she asked. Bear paused. "You thinking about filing?" "I'm thinking about the hearing. If there's a hearing, the footage becomes part of the record. And if it's part of the record, it's not just about me anymore. It's about his pattern." "That's a hard road," Bear said carefully. "Hearings like that, they put you on display. Warren will say things about you, things designed to make the board look at your situation as the homelessness, the diner address, and decide you're not credible." "I know." She already knew. She'd been uncredible to powerful people for 8 months. She understood the game. "But if I stay quiet, he does this to the next person. And the one after that." A long pause. "You'd be going in there alone," Bear said. "I can't be in that room with you." "I know that too." "I can be outside," he said quietly. "That's not nothing." "No," she agreed, "it's not." Derek stopped double-checking her work on a Thursday, 22 days into the trial. She didn't make a thing of it. She didn't acknowledge it, didn't change her pace, didn't do anything that would require him to respond. She just kept working. But she noticed the way she noticed everything, and she filed it. Later that day, he came to her station while she was finishing a valve adjustment on a Honda that one of the regulars had brought in. He stood there for a moment, the slightly uncomfortable posture of a man who is about to do something that costs him something. "That's good work," he said, nodding at the Honda. She looked up. "Thank you." He looked like he might add something, then decided against it. He walked back to his station. Roy, passing behind her with a tray of hardware, said nothing. But she caught the slight change in his expression, something that on a less economical face might have been a smile. That evening, she called Bear to tell him the trial was going well. He said, "I know. Roy called me." She felt something that was not quite surprise. She had suspected Roy reported to Bear in some capacity, and not quite satisfaction, but somewhere between them. "What did he say?" "He said, you know what you're doing and you're not trying to make people know it," Bear said. For Roy, that's the highest compliment he gives. She thought about that for a moment. "Tell him thank you. Tell him yourself when I'm back in the shop. When are you coming back?" "I was going to say 3 weeks," Bear said, "but someone gave me some statistical advice about reinfarction risk." 4 weeks, she said. 4 weeks, he agreed. The licensing board hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning, 3 weeks out. The notice arrived certified mail to Iron Haven's address, which Haley had listed as her contact on the formal complaint she'd filed jointly with 3 former Red Mesa employees, including a woman named Daniela Reyes, who had worked for Warren for 2 years and had 14 months of documented payroll. Discrepancies in a folder she'd kept in a shoebox under her bed because she'd been afraid to use it, but had never been able to bring herself to throw it away. Samantha Reed's footage was submitted with the complaint. Haley watched it once, alone, on the laptop Grizz had set up for her, and she didn't watch it a second time. Once was enough. The footage was clear. Her compression sequence was uninterrupted on camera. Warren's approach, his hand on her shoulder, his instruction to stop all of it visible, time-stamped, undeniable. She closed the laptop and sat with it for a while. Not with anger. With something more complicated, the feeling of having a thing confirmed that you already knew, but hadn't yet been able to prove, which should feel like victory, but felt, at least at first, more like grief. Because the footage didn't just prove she hadn't stolen anything. It proved that while she was trying to keep a man alive, her employer had been calculating his legal exposure and decided that exposure mattered more than the life. She had known that. She had been there. But seeing it on a screen, in black and white, in 30 seconds of footage that any reasonable person who watched it would understand immediately that was different. That made it real in a way that her own memory, alone, couldn't. She called her mother's number by accident that night. Old reflex. The one she hadn't completely unlearned in the 11 months since the number had gone inactive. It rang twice and hit a disconnection tone, and she sat holding the phone afterward. Not embarrassed, not undone, just sitting with the specific shape of that particular missing. Then she opened the notebook, wrote a date at the top of a blank page, and started drafting what she was going to say at the hearing. The morning of the hearing, Bear called at 6:45. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Prepared," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at the borrowed blazer hanging from the door, dark gray, too big in the shoulders, borrowed from because she didn't own anything suitable and had refused the offer of a shopping trip on someone else's credit card. She'd folded a square of her mother's notebook paper and put it in the breast pocket, not for luck, just because she wanted something of her mother's in the room. "Nervous," she said. "But clear. Clear is better than calm," Bear said. "I know." A pause. "Grizz is going to be there, a few others. You won't see them until you come out." "You're not going to be there?" A beat. "I'm going to be there," he said. "Linda's not going to be happy about it, but I'm going to be there." She thought about telling him not to push his recovery. She decided against it. She understood what the gesture meant, and telling him not to make it would be denying him something that mattered. "Okay," she said. "Haley." His voice again at that lower register. "You're going in there alone, and you're going to win it alone. That's how it has to be. But you need to know that alone and without support are not the same thing." She stood up straighter, almost without meaning to. "I know that," she said. She walked into the licensing board office at 8:58, 2 minutes before the session opened, wearing a borrowed blazer and carrying her mother's paramedic notebook and the steady, well-earned belief that she knew exactly what had happened and exactly how to say it. Warren was already there, seated with a lawyer in a gray suit, and he looked at her with the confident, dismissive expression of a man who had done this before, who had used these rooms, these processes, these official tables to win arguments against people who came in alone and without resources, who had learned that the machinery of formal process could be weaponized if you knew how it worked and your opponent didn't. He saw her blazer. He saw the notebook. He smiled, just slightly, in the way a man smiles when he thinks he knows how a fight is going to end. She took her seat across from him and set the notebook on the table and looked at the board members without performing anything. No warmth, no aggression, just the clear, steady directness of someone who had been watching people try to read her for 8 months and was no longer afraid of the reading. The session began. Warren's lawyer went first. He was well practiced, his language calibrated for precisely this kind of room, civic, reasonable sounding, carefully designed to make Haley's lack of an address sound like evidence of instability rather than the consequence of a predatory landlord and a mother's expensive death. He used the word erratic. He used the phrase unclear employment history. He did not mention the cardiac event directly, but he framed the entire situation around a workplace incident that had unfortunately escalated due to an employee's unauthorized actions. Haley wrote 2 words on the corner of her notebook page: security footage. Then it was her turn. She didn't stand up to perform. She didn't use a raised voice or a constructed emotional appeal. She spoke the way her mother had spoken on handoffs, cleanly, sequentially, accounting for every significant fact in the order in which it occurred. She told the board what had happened in the diner. She told them what Warren had said and done while Caleb was on the floor. She told them about the storage fee, the $40 a week, the way it appeared on her pay stub under a category that didn't correspond to any legitimate business expense. She told them about Daniela's payroll records, about the other employees, about the pattern that the documentation would show if the board chose to look at it. She said, I came in here without a lawyer because I cannot afford one. I came in here with a notebook because everything I know, I learned from a woman who believed that facts, stated clearly, are the most powerful thing a person can bring into a room. Warren Pike is counting on this board to see my circumstances and conclude that someone in my position is not credible. I would ask instead that you look at what is documented and decide based on that. She set the notebook down. The footage will show what happened, she said. I'll let it speak for itself. In the silence that followed, Warren's lawyer leaned toward his client and said something in a voice too low to hear clearly. Warren's expression had shifted. The slight smile was gone. Outside, she couldn't hear it yet, but the engines had already started arriving. Not a roar, not an aggressive convergence. The measured, deliberate sound of hundreds of people who had decided to be somewhere, pulling in from every direction, parking in organized lines, standing quietly beside their machines, veterans and nurses, former diner employees, ordinary people from across Tucson who had watched the footage online, who had read the story in pieces through social media, who had driven to this building on a Friday morning because something had crossed their threshold and they'd decided to cross one of their own. And among them, leaning against his bike, with a cane he was not yet ready to retire, and an expression that Linda would have correctly identified as willful stubbornness, Caleb Maddox waited. Inside the hearing room, the board chair asked Warren's lawyer if his client wished to provide the security footage from the day of the incident. Warren's lawyer said they would need additional time to locate the relevant files. The board chair noted that the complainant had already submitted that footage and asked if the respondent had any objection to its review. The room went very quiet. Warren looked at Haley. She looked back at him, and her expression held the same quality it had held on the floor of the diner, not anger, not triumph, but the absolute grounded certainty of someone who knows exactly what is on the record and is not afraid of anyone seeing it. The board chair said, "Let's proceed." The footage ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The board chair watched it without speaking. The two members beside her watched it without speaking. Warren's lawyer watched it with the specific stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about his position. Warren watched approximately 40 seconds of it and then looked at the table in front of him and did not look up again. Nobody in the room needed the footage explained to them. It showed Haley on the floor beside Caleb, both hands locked, her full body weight behind every compression, her face set with the concentrated effort of someone doing something she knew how to do and was refusing to stop doing. It showed Warren approaching from the left side of the frame. It showed his hand on her shoulder. It showed her shake it off without breaking rhythm. It showed Warren's mouth moving the board chair, would later request the audio track, which confirmed the words, "Step back," which confirmed the phrase, "Let the ambulance handle it," which confirmed the directive issued by a business owner to the only person keeping his customer alive while that customer was actively dying on his floor. Then it showed Arthur Vance, the Vietnam veteran, standing up from his booth. It showed him walking to where Warren stood and positioning himself between Warren and Haley without a word. It showed Warren stopping. The board chair asked Warren's lawyer if his client wished to make a statement regarding the footage. The lawyer requested a recess. The board chair granted 7 minutes. Haley sat at her table during the recess and did not move. She drank water from the cup in front of her. She breathed. She was aware of her pulse in a way she usually wasn't, the particular heightened awareness of a body that has been running on controlled adrenaline for 3 hours and knows it's approaching the edge of what controlled looks like. She thought about her mother. Specifically, she thought about a thing her mother used to do before difficult situations, a simple, private inventory. What do I know? What can I control? What matters most right now? Her mother had said it wasn't meditation, wasn't spiritual, wasn't anything fancy. It was just the way a paramedic organized herself when everything was happening at once, and she needed to act from her clearest self rather than her most frightened one. What Haley knew, the footage was unambiguous. The documentation was solid. Daniela's payroll records were in the board's possession. Samantha Reed had submitted a written statement. 3 other former employees had done the same. What she could control, how she conducted herself in this room for however much time remained. What mattered most, not Warren's consequences, the people who'd had no one to call, making sure the board understood that Warren Pike was a system, not an incident, and that the system had been running on the invisibility of people who couldn't fight back. The recess ended. Warren's lawyer came back to the table with the expression of someone who has had 7 minutes to understand that the ground has shifted in a fundamental way and is now managing an orderly retreat rather than a defense. He said his client was prepared to cooperate with a full audit of payroll records. The board chair said that was the board's intention, regardless. Warren looked up then, just briefly, and looked at Haley with an expression she didn't have a clean name for. Not quite anger, not quite desperation, somewhere in between, the expression of a man who had built something over a long time, using a specific set of tools, and was now watching those tools removed from his hands one at a time. He opened his mouth. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. Warren closed his mouth. The board chair looked at Haley. Ms. Monroe, you made a statement earlier about the pattern of conduct at this establishment. You mentioned other employees. Are those individuals prepared to provide testimony if requested? 3 have already submitted written statements, Haley said. 2 others are willing to speak in person, but requested that their names not appear in public documents due to concerns about retaliation. They're aware of their options under Arizona whistleblower statute. The board chair wrote something down. You researched the statute. I had 3 weeks, Haley said. I used them. Something moved across the board chair's face. Not a smile, exactly. More like the recognition one person gives another when they see someone operating at their full capacity under difficult conditions. We'll take a brief adjournment, the board chair said, and then we'll reconvene to discuss preliminary findings. She stepped outside into the heat. The sound hit her before her eyes adjusted. Not loud, not aggressive, but present and vast. The layered rumble of hundreds of engines that had been switched off and were now only a background vibration, the residue of machines at rest. She stood on the steps and took it in. They were everywhere. Not in formation, not in the organized rows of a demonstration or a parade. Parked the way people park when they've arrived for something that matters at angles. Along the curb, filling the lot across the street, spilling into side roads, motorcycles, and pickup trucks and a row of cars she recognized as belonging to some of the nurses from St. Michael's, who'd started following the story when Caleb was their patient. People standing in groups, talking quietly, drinking coffee from cups they'd brought themselves. A retired couple who'd watched Samantha Reed's video 3 times and driven 40 minutes because they felt, independently of each other and then together, that they should be somewhere visible today. Grizz was at the bottom of the steps. He looked at her and raised his eyebrows in a question. Preliminary findings are positive, she said. Full audit of payroll. The licensing suspension is likely. Grizz exhaled slowly. Good. Where is he? Grizz didn't have to ask who. He tilted his head to the left. Bear was leaning against the side of his bike with the cane propped against the seat, and Linda's hand through his arm, though Linda's expression made clear that she was there as both moral support and a physical monitor of exactly how much her husband was pushing his recovery. He looked better than the last time she'd seen him, color back in his face. The specific aliveness of a person who had come close to not being alive and was still slightly amazed to find themselves standing. He was wearing his vest. Of course he was. He saw her coming and straightened up, just slightly, and the movement cost him something she could see in his jaw. But he held it. She stopped in front of him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Around them, the crowd had registered her emergence, and a low, undirected sound moved through it. Not a cheer, not applause. Something more organic than that. The collective release of tension from a large group of people who had been waiting for something and had just received the first indication of how it was going. You're supposed to be taking 4 weeks, she said. I'm standing still, Bear said. That barely counts, Linda said. From his left side, and with the precision of a woman who had 30 years of context for her husband's rationalizations, he's been standing still for 2 hours. His cardiologist doesn't know he's here and will not be finding out from me because I value my marriage. Haley looked at Bear. The footage did what it needed to do. I know. Grizz was monitoring. Warren's lawyer pulled him back. They're cooperating with the audit. Bear nodded slowly. That means they know what the audit's going to find. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes and the expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it in a way that was true without being too large. You went in there alone, he said. I went in there with everything I needed, she said. There's a difference. Something shifted in his expression. She had the sense, not for the first time, that he was revising something, some assumption, some expectation in real time. Your mother, he said. She taught you how to walk into a room like that? She taught me what to bring into the room, Haley said. Facts, sequence, clarity. She said the rest of it, the fear, the anger, the wanting people to see you, that's all noise. You can feel it, but you don't lead with it. Bear was quiet for a moment. Smart woman. The smartest. Linda had been listening. She reached across and put her hand briefly on Haley's wrist, not grabbing. Just a touch. The kind that communicates something that doesn't have a clean verbal equivalent. Haley didn't pull away. Then the board chair appeared at the top of the steps. The crowd registered her presence, and the ambient conversation dropped away. The board chair looked out at the assembled people with the measured expression of a public official who has just had her understanding of a situation significantly expanded by the sight of 300 people standing outside her building on a Friday morning. She looked at Haley at the bottom of the steps and said, Ms. Monroe, would you come back inside? The preliminary findings took 11 minutes to read into the record. Red Mesa Diner's operating license was suspended, pending a full audit. A formal referral was made to the Arizona Department of Labor for investigation of wage theft and fraudulent payroll deductions affecting an estimated 9 to 14 current and former employees. A separate referral was made to the county district attorney's office regarding the conduct documented in the security footage, specifically the instruction issued to cease CPR during an active cardiac emergency, which the board chair noted raised questions that were beyond the board's scope, but not beyond the scope of law. Warren Pike sat through all of it without expression, which was its own kind of expression. Haley sat through it making small, precise notes in the margin of her mother's notebook, because the specifics mattered, and she wanted to be able to share the accurate version with Daniela and the other women who had trusted her enough to add their names to the complaint. When the session was formally closed, Warren stood up and walked toward the door without looking at her. He stopped at the doorway. She didn't know why, couldn't read the impulse. He turned back. He looked at her across the room with something that was not quite remorse and not quite acknowledgement, but was in the general territory of both. He opened his mouth. Don't, she said quietly, not angrily. Just a statement of preference. He left. She sat in the room alone for approximately 2 minutes after everyone else had cleared out. She looked at her mother's notebook on the table. She thought about all the people who had walked out of Red Mesa's back door alone, $40 lighter each week, carrying the specific humiliation of someone who has understood they are being exploited and has had no recourse. She thought about Daniela's shoebox of payroll records kept for 14 months, afraid to use them, afraid to throw them away. She picked up the note, stood up, and walked back outside. When she appeared at the top of the steps, the sound that moved through the crowd was not the sound she'd expected. There was no cheer, no dramatic upswell. What happened was quieter than that. People straightened. Conversation stopped. And then, beginning with the veterans closest to the stairs and moving outward through the crowd like a wave, people began to clap, not the frantic applause of a sporting event, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of people who mean it. Each strike of palm against palm, carrying the full weight of a considered decision. She stood at the top of the stairs and felt it move through her and did not perform a response to it. She let herself be there. That was all. Bear made his way to the bottom of the steps with the cane, and Linda's hand and the slightly excessive dignity of a large man determined not to let a bad heart make him look diminished. He looked up at her. Well, he said, license suspended. Labor referral. She came down 2 steps. It's going to take time. It's not finished, no, he said. But it started. She nodded. Come here, Bear said. And he opened his arms, and for a fraction of a second, the old reflex fired the one that said, be careful. That said, powerful people have conditions. That said, accepting comfort creates debt. The reflex was fast. Her recognition of it was faster. She went down the last 2 steps and let him put his arms around her. Briefly, solidly. The hug of someone who has a specific reason to be grateful and is expressing it without theater. She felt him exhale over her shoulder. A long breath, the kind that carries more than air. She stepped back. Her eyes were dry. She was a little surprised by that, and then she wasn't. The emotion was there, fully present. She could feel the weight of it, but she'd spent so long learning to hold things until she could hold them privately that her body defaulted to it. She didn't fight it. Grizz was behind Bear, watching her with the quiet attention he'd had from the beginning. Since that first morning outside the gas station, when he'd said your name like it was something he'd been carrying carefully. He gave her a single nod. She gave it back. The afternoon had a different quality. People began to disperse, not abruptly but gradually. The way a crowd moves when the thing it came for has concluded, and the conclusion was the right one. Small conversations, handshakes, the exchanging of phone numbers between people who had met that morning and discovered they had reasons to stay in contact. The nurses from St. Michael's found Samantha Reed, who had come without telling anyone, standing at the edge of the crowd, and wrapped her in the kind of communal warmth that Samantha had clearly not anticipated and was visibly uncertain how to receive. Haley saw it from across the lot and made a mental note to call Samantha that evening. Daniela Reyes found her near the bikes and hugged her hard and said, against her shoulder, they're really going to look at the payroll records? Every page, Haley said, and they'll find everything. Daniela pulled back. Her eyes were wet. I kept those records for over a year. My husband thought I was crazy. He kept saying it wasn't going to matter. It mattered, Haley said. You made it matter. We made it matter, Daniela corrected her. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm buying you lunch. I know I don't have to. That's why I want to. Daniela said it with the firm practicality of a woman who had spent a year feeling powerless and had just felt the opposite and was not interested in false modesty. Let me buy you lunch, Haley. She let her. 3 weeks after the hearing, the Labor Department's preliminary report confirmed wage theft affecting 11 former and current employees of Red Mesa Diner, with total underpaid wages estimated at over $40,000 across a 4-year period. Warren Pike's operating license was not reinstated. A criminal complaint was formally filed. Haley received a check for the wages she'd been shorted, 4 months of $40 weekly deductions, misclassified tip allocations, and 2 weeks of wages that had been withheld under the pretextual training repayment clause. She held the check for a long time. It was not a large amount in absolute terms. It was the largest amount anyone had ever formally acknowledged was owed to her. She deposited it. She paid her rent 3 months ahead. She put the remainder in a savings account she opened that afternoon. Her first savings account, her name alone on the paperwork, her signature the only one required. She told Bear about it that evening. Good, he said. That money is yours. What are you going to do with it? EMT certification exam fee first, she said. I've been studying. I think I'm ready. 2 months. There's a testing window in October. I'll be there, he said immediately. Bear, you don't need to, Haley. His voice had that quality again. Let me be there. She thought about the hearing, about the crowd outside, about what he'd said to her afterward, about alone and without support not being the same thing, about how long she'd confused the two. Okay, she said, but you're not allowed to make it into a production. I'm a 60-year-old man with a cane, Bear said. Everything I do is already a production. You're going to have to make peace with that. She laughed. The full version, unguarded, the laugh that had started coming back to her in pieces over the past weeks. He heard it, and she could tell from the pause on his side of the line that it meant something to him, though he would never say so directly, because they had developed the specific communication style of two people who express care through action and practical honesty and leave sentiment for the moments when it can't be avoided. October arrived the way Tucson Octobers did. Cooler nights, the particular clarity of desert air after summer finally relinquishes its grip. Haley had been at Iron Haven for 4 months. Her trial period had ended on day 31 when Roy appeared at her workstation at 7 in the morning and said, without preamble, "You're staying." She had said okay. They had both returned to work. Derek had become something she hadn't anticipated, not a friend exactly, but a colleague in the full sense of the word, someone who showed up to work with the same professional seriousness she did and had eventually decided that her work ethic and his were compatible enough to warrant respect. He was not generous with it. He never would be. But when he gave it, it was real, and she had learned that real was what she was after. She had also, without designing it, become the person at Iron Haven that people came to with medical questions. It happened gradually. Someone's kid had a rash. Someone's father had described chest symptoms over the phone, and they weren't sure if it was serious. Someone had a chainsaw accident and needed the wound packed properly before the doctor could see them. She handled each one with the same efficient calm, gave what information she legitimately had, told people clearly when something required a doctor and why, and was scrupulously honest about the difference between what she knew and what she thought. Bear noticed. He said one morning over the coffee they shared before the garage opened, "You know you're already doing the job." "I know," she said. "I want the certification. The knowledge isn't the same as the credential. The credential means I can do it officially, and officially matters." "I wasn't suggesting it doesn't," he said. "I was saying I see what you're building." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I want to be the person who could have helped my mother faster. When she got sick, there was a window. 2 weeks where, if someone had recognized the symptoms earlier and responded correctly, the outcome might have been different." She paused. "I don't know that for certain, but I know enough now to know the window existed and nobody saw it." Bear was quiet. "I'm not trying to undo it," she said. "I know it doesn't work that way. I want to be the person who sees the window. For the next person." Bear set his coffee down. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of being moved, not theatrical, just a slight shift in the stillness around his eyes. "Your mother would recognize you," he said finally. "It was the right thing." She didn't know how he knew it was the right thing, but he did. She held on to it. The morning of the EMT certification exam, she was awake at 5. She didn't review her notes. She'd reviewed her notes for 8 weeks, and reviewing them again at 5 in the morning was not studying. It was anxiety performing as productivity, and she recognized the difference. Instead, she made coffee, sat with her mother's notebook, and read old entries from her mother's actual working life clinical notes, training observations, the occasional margin comment that was more personal, her mother's voice coming through the shorthand the way it always did. At 7:30, she put the notebook in her bag and took the bus to the testing center. She was the first one there. The exam ran 4 hours. She moved through it with the particular quality of focus she'd developed over years of necessity, not the manic focus of someone terrified of failure, but the steady page-by-page attention of someone who has prepared thoroughly and trusts the preparation. There were 4 questions she paused on. She worked each one methodically, eliminated what she could eliminate, committed to her best answer, and moved on. Revisiting uncertain answers was something she'd learned to do judiciously. Too much revision, and you started second-guessing correct responses out of anxiety, which was a different kind of error than not knowing the material. She turned in her exam at 11:42. She walked outside. They were there. Not hundreds. This was not the licensing board hearing. This was not the kind of moment that required 300 motorcycles. This was something smaller and more specific. Bear and his cane. Grizz with a paper coffee cup. Roy, who had taken the morning off without explanation, which was the most demonstrative thing Roy had ever done. Daniela. Garcia. Linda, who had driven Bear despite his insistence that he was capable of driving himself, and her equally firm insistence that his capable and her comfortable were two different metrics. And Derek, standing slightly apart from the others, hands in his pockets, in the specific posture of a man who is somewhere he's chosen to be, but hasn't fully decided what to do with his face about it. Bear looked at her. "Well, I feel good," she said. "Results in 48 hours. "That's not an answer," Grizz said. "It's the only answer I have right now." She looked at the group of them, this specific, improbable collection of people assembled outside a testing center on a Tuesday morning because of a chain of events that had started on a diner floor with a man's heart giving out and a 20-year-old woman refusing to stop. She felt the weight of it. Without naming it, Bear stepped forward. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small key, old, worn, the kind of key that had been handled many times. He held it out. She looked at it, then at him. "What is that?" "Your mother's motorcycle," he said. "The one that was repossessed after her death. I found it through a dealer in Phoenix about 6 weeks ago." He paused. "The guys at Iron Haven did the restoration. Roy supervised. Derek did the engine." She looked at Derek. Derek was studying something extremely interesting on the ground near his left shoe. She looked back at Bear. The key was still in his outstretched hand. "How much?" she said. "Haley, how much did it cost to find it and restore it?" She said it clearly, without defensiveness, the same way she said everything she meant. "I want to know what I'm agreeing to repay." Bear looked at her for a long moment. He understood. She knew he understood that this was not stubbornness. It was not false independence or misplaced pride. It was the specific, hard-won principle of a person who had learned that accepting things without terms was how you ended up owing things you hadn't agreed to owe. "We can work out a payment schedule," he said. "Fair price. No interest. You pay when you can." "Write it down," she said. "I'll have Grizz write it down." She took the key. She held it for a long time without speaking. The small, ordinary weight of it, the specific meaning of a thing returned, not given, returned, because it had always been hers. It had just been somewhere she couldn't reach it. Her eyes, which had been dry, through the hearing, through the crowd on the courthouse steps, through 4 months of proving herself and fighting a false accusation and rebuilding from concrete ground up, her eyes filled. She didn't apologize for it. She just let it happen. Standing there with the key in her palm, in front of these people who had become something she was still finding the right word for, and she let herself cry, the way people cry when they have been strong for a very long time and are finally in a place where the strength and the feeling can exist at the same time. Bear didn't say anything. He put one hand on her shoulder, the solid, unhurried weight of it. Linda, from behind him, said quietly, "That's what it's supposed to feel like." The 48 hours passed. She was in the garage when the email arrived, a standard Tuesday morning. Hands on a throttle assembly, Roy 3 feet away with a torque wrench. Her phone lit up in her pocket. She stepped back from the workstation. She opened the email. She read it twice. Roy watched her expression and didn't ask. She looked up. "I passed." Roy set down the torque wrench. He crossed the garage. He shook her hand once, firmly, with the grip of a man who means it and the restraint of a man who doesn't perform things. "Congratulations," he said. She called Bear. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "I passed," she said. The sound he made, not a word, just a sound. The specific exhale of a man who has been invested in an outcome and has just received the right one, told her more than anything he could have said. "When do you start?" he said. "I already talked to the ambulance service," she said. "Weekend shifts. Starting next month." She paused. "And I want to talk to you about something else." "Tell me." "Iron Haven should have a formal training program," she said. "EMT prep, CPR certification, mechanical apprenticeships. Paid positions, not volunteer slots. For people aging out of foster care, People who are unhoused, people who are where I was 8 months ago and can't get their foot in the door because they don't have an address to put on an application. Silence on the line. I've already drafted the structure, she said. I know the curriculum. I have contacts at the hospital who will partner on the clinical side. I can write the grant applications. I just need Iron Haven to commit to the space and the employment structure. Bear said, how long have you been working on this? Since the second week of my trial, she said. A pause. Then send me the draft. I already sent it, she said. 2 hours ago. Check your email. Another pause. Haley. Yeah? Your mother? He said. Did she know she was raising someone like you? She thought about the kitchen table, the long shifts, the way her mother sat with exhaustion like it was a companion she'd made peace with, the way she'd looked at Haley sometimes in the specific, private way of a parent who sees something in their child that gives them hope they don't know how to name. I think she had an idea, Haley said. Bear read the program draft in one sitting. He knew this because Linda told Grizz afterward that he'd gone into the study at 9 in the evening and come out at 10:45 without his coffee, which meant he'd been reading too intently to remember it was there. When Grizz relayed that detail to Haley the following morning, she filed it the way she filed everything useful quietly, precisely without making more of it than it was. But she noted it. Bear called her at 7 the next morning, earlier than he usually called. The grant structure is solid, he said without preamble. The curriculum sequence is better than solid. The partnership model with the hospital is the right approach. Clinical hours need institutional backing. You can't build that from scratch. The housing component needs one more layer. You're relying too much on voluntary landlord participation. You need a formal MOU with at least 2 property managers before you launch, or the housing piece falls apart under the first case that doesn't go smoothly. She had her notebook open. She'd been expecting feedback and had not been expecting the specific precision of it. I had the same concern, she said. I identified 2 property managers in the Valley who have existing relationships with veteran housing programs. I was going to approach them next week. A pause. You already had that. I had the problem identified. The solution was the next step. Send me their names before you approach them, Bear said. One of them, if it's who I think it is, his cousin runs a chapter in New Mexico. There's existing trust there that'll shorten the conversation. She wrote it down. Okay, the name, Bear said. You're calling it the Monroe Roadside Rescue Program. She'd expected him to say something about this. She'd gone back and forth on it. For 2 weeks, the name felt presumptuous in a way she couldn't fully articulate, honoring her mother while also putting her own name on something she was still building, still proving. It's my mother's name, she said carefully, not mine. The program exists because of what she taught me. The name is meant to reflect that. I know whose name it is, Bear said. I'm not questioning the choice. I'm saying it out loud because it deserves to be said out loud. Monroe Roadside Rescue Program. He said it the way you say a thing you want to be real. It's a good name. She looked at the notebook, her mother's handwriting on the page in front of her, from a training seminar 11 years ago. Notes about pediatric airways in the neat, fast cursive of a woman who never had enough time and always showed up anyway. Thank you, Haley said. One more thing, Bear said. What? The first applicant. You're going to get applications from people who want the credential, people who want the paycheck, people who are curious. You're also going to get 1 or 2 who need it the way you needed it, not the program. But the thing underneath the program. The thing that says somebody sees you as a whole person and not a problem to be managed. He paused. Those are the ones you have to get right. The first one especially. The first one sets the tone for everything that follows. She thought about the gas station and Garcia's voice saying her name like he'd been carrying it carefully. She thought about the phone call with Bear, his voice in that lower register, saying, ask her what she needs, not tell her what she's getting. I know, she said. I've been thinking about how to structure the intake conversation for exactly that reason. I figured you had. Bear? Yeah. Thank you, she said again. And this time, she meant something different by it, not for the specific feedback, but for the larger thing. The one that didn't have a clean name, the one she'd been carrying since the morning. Garcia found her outside the gas station, and she'd taken the phone and heard a man who had nearly died asking first whether she was all right. Bear was quiet for a moment. "Don't thank me," he said. "You handed me back my life on a diner floor. Everything after that is just me trying to make it worth something." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. She let it sit between them, the way important things sometimes needed to sit. The program launched on a Thursday in early December, not with fanfare, not with a press release or a ceremony, or the kind of announcement designed to attract attention to the announcers. Haley had been deliberate about this. She'd seen enough organizations launch programs with elaborate opening events that served the organization's image more than the people the program was meant to reach. And she was not going to do that. The launch was a website going live, an information card distributed through the hospital, through the Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter, through the 2 shelters with the shortest wait lists and the most functional intake processes. The card was 1 page. It said what the program offered, what it required, and who to contact. The contact was her direct number. She got 11 calls in the first week. 7 were people who had questions. 2 were people who had something to offer: a retired EMT instructor willing to volunteer curriculum review, a property manager in Maricopa County who had heard about the program through the VFW and wanted to discuss the housing component. 1 was a reporter from a Tucson paper who had covered the licensing board hearing and wanted to write about the program on Mike, which Haley agreed to, with the condition that the story focus on the program's participants and not on her or the diner or Bear or anything that had already been told. The reporter said, "That's an unusual condition." Haley said, "The people this program is trying to reach need to see themselves in the story. If it's about me, it doesn't do that." The reporter was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I quote you on that?" "Yes," Haley said. "That part you can quote." The 11th call was from a young man named Cody Lane. He called on a Friday evening, which meant he'd waited all week, which meant he'd had the card for at least several days and had talked himself into calling and then back out of it at least twice. She recognized the pattern without him having to describe it. His voice was careful, in the specific way of someone who has learned to modulate every word he says in case the wrong one gives someone leverage. He said he'd seen the card at the shelter on Congress Street. He said he was 23 and had been sleeping in his car for 4 months. He said he was good with engines and could prove it if given the chance, but that every place he'd applied had asked for a permanent address and he didn't have one and didn't know how to solve that problem. He said, "At the end of all of that, I don't want charity. I just want a fair shot." She recognized those words. She had said them herself, in a different order, to a man recovering in a hospital bed, through a phone she'd borrowed because her own was dead. "I know," she said. "What kind of engines?" A pause. He hadn't expected the question. "What? You said you're good with engines. What kind? Cars, motorcycles, small equipment. What's your background?" He answered. And she could hear the shift in his voice as he moved from defended to engaged. The specific animation that comes when a person who has been reduced to their circumstances is suddenly being asked about their actual knowledge. He was good. Better than good. He'd been working on vehicles since he was 16. Had taught himself carburetor rebuilds from library books and YouTube videos. Had done engine swaps in parking lots with borrowed tools. She asked 2 more questions. She listened to the answers. Then she said, "Come in Monday morning at 7. Ask for me at the side door. Bring whatever you need for a full day of work. The first week is paid 5 days, fair wage, no conditions attached beyond showing up and doing the work. At the end of the week, we'll talk about what comes next." Silence on his end. "Cody," she said. "Yeah? There's a room on the 2nd floor of the garage. It's small. Has a lock on the door that nobody else has a key to. If you need to leave your things somewhere safe while you're working, that's available." She paused. "It's not a permanent housing solution, but it's a place nobody can take your belongings while you're trying to figure out the next step." She heard him breathing. The specific, effortful breath of someone managing something large with a small opening. "Monday at 7, he said. Monday at 7, she confirmed. She hung up and sat with the call for a moment. She thought about the supply room behind Red Mesa and the $40 weekly fee. She thought about a lock with a key that belonged only to her. She thought about all the ways the same basic human needs safety, a place to exist without being in debt, for it could be answered with dignity instead of leverage, if the person in the position to offer it chose dignity. She thought about her mother. She thought about her a lot these days, not with the same quality of grief that had accompanied the first year, the raw, destabilizing grief of someone whose floor has been removed, but with a different kind of presence. Her mother had become someone she consulted, not mystically, not through any belief she didn't hold, but in the practical way of someone whose thinking had been so thoroughly shaped by another person's way of moving through the world that the other person's perspective was accessible at any time. She would ask herself, what would she notice that I'm missing? What would she say about this? And the answers came not as voices or visions, but as the organic product of having paid attention for 20 years to the most careful person she'd ever known. She thought her mother would have liked Cody Lane's voice when he started talking about engines. Monday came, and Cody came with it. He arrived at 6:52, which meant he'd been there for at least 15 minutes before he came to the door, working himself up to knocking. He was 23 and looked younger than that, with the particular thinness of someone whose calorie budget had been tight for a while, and a layer of defensive quiet over everything that Haley recognized immediately and did not try to dismantle. You didn't dismantle that kind of quiet. You gave it time and evidence and let it make its own decision. She showed him the room first, the lock, the key. She handed him the key and said, "This one's yours. There's no other copy. When you're done with the program, you give it back. While you're here, nobody comes in without your permission." He looked at the key the way she had looked at the motorcycle key, the specific attention of someone receiving something that is small in itself and enormous in what it represents. "Okay," he said. "Now come meet Roy." Roy looked at Cody for approximately 4 seconds and then handed him a shop rag and pointed at a transmission that needed cleaning before anything else could happen to it. Cody went to work. Roy watched him for 90 seconds, confirmed what he needed to confirm, and walked away without comment. Haley watched from across the garage. She caught Roy's eye as he passed. He gave the slight nod that was his entire vocabulary of approval. She went back to her own workstation. At 10 o'clock, she checked on Cody. The transmission was clean, not quickly clean, thoroughly clean. The way you do something when you actually care about it. He was already on the second task Roy had given him, working with the careful efficiency of someone who knew the work and was concentrating very hard on not visibly knowing it too well, in case knowing it too well somehow disqualified him. She recognized that too. "You can show what you know," she said, quietly, so only he heard. "This isn't a test you can oversell. Do the work at the level you're actually capable of." He looked up. Something shifted in his expression, the defensive layer, just slightly, just enough. "Okay," he said. She left him to it. December moved through the garage the way work time does, not fast, not slow, but measured in completed tasks and incremental progress, and the particular satisfaction of things that needed doing getting done. Cody's first week became a second week without formal discussion. At the end of the second week, Roy told Haley, "He's staying," in exactly the tone he'd used with her, and Haley told Roy, "I know," in exactly the tone she'd used then. Bear came into the garage on the Wednesday of that second week for the first time since the cardiac event. Not full hours, he was clear-eyed about that. The 4-week recovery advice having graduated into a general post-myocardial acceptance that his body had renegotiated some of its terms, but for 2 hours in the morning to sit with the work and the people and the smell of motor oil and metal. That had been part of his life for so long it was indistinguishable from the air he breathed. He sat at the work table near the coffee station and watched Cody work for a while without introducing himself. Cody, who had been at Iron Haven for 10 days and had learned to read the room, noticed the vest and said nothing, but his shoulders changed slightly, the micro-tension of someone recalibrating their environment. Eventually, Bear said, without looking up from the coffee cup he was holding. Transmission job on the far bay needs a second opinion. Roy's hands are full. Cody looked at him. I can look at it. Go ahead. Cody went. Bear watched him go. Haley, passing with a toolbox, caught Bear's expression and recognized it the same way he'd watched her in the early weeks, with that patient, assessing attention that was not judgment and was not warmth, but was something precise that sat between them. Don't recruit him before he's found his footing, she said, quietly as she passed. Bear looked at her. Something like amusement moved through his eyes. I'm having coffee. You're doing exactly what you did with me, she said. Give him a month, he considered it. 3 weeks, Bear. A month, he conceded. She kept walking. The 1-year mark arrived in June. It arrived the way significant dates tend to arrive when you're inside your own life, not dramatically. Not with the sweep of music and reflection, the movies assigned to such moments, but as a Tuesday that was slightly warmer than average and began with coffee at 6:30 and Cody asking whether the Honda in Bay 3 needed a full gasket replacement or could hold for another 6 weeks with a seal patch. She told him full replacement and explained why, and he asked 3 follow-up questions that told her he was tracking the reasoning and not just the answer. And she thought, good. That's the difference between someone learning a skill and someone building understanding. She thought about the version of herself 1 year ago. The overpass, the $63, her mother's notebook, and the engine of controlled fear she'd been running on for 8 months. She didn't look at that version of herself with the complicated, distanced compassion people sometimes use to look at who they used to be. She looked at her with the directness she applied to everything. That person had done what needed to be done. She had held on, had kept the count, had made the right call on a diner floor, and refused to stop when someone told her to stop. And everything that had followed was built on that foundation. The ceremony Bear had insisted on calling it a ceremony, which Haley had insisted was too large a word. They had arrived at the compromise of a gathering was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon at Iron Haven's back lot. She had not known about the scale of it until she walked out the side door at 1:55. They came back. Not all 300, this was not the licensing board. This was not a statement to a city that needed to pay attention. It was something different. The people who came back were the ones for whom this had become personal. Bear's network, yes, riders from Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, a contingent from California that Garcia had coordinated, but also the nurses from St. Michael's, the retired EMT instructor who had spent 5 months volunteering his Thursday mornings to Haley's certification prep classes, Daniela Reyes, who had brought her husband, who had a handshake that apologized for his previous skepticism without using any words, Arthur Vance, who had stood up from his booth in the diner a year ago and placed himself between Haley and Warren Pike with the quiet authority of a man who had once been responsible for other people's lives and had never entirely stopped. He was wearing a tie. Samantha Reed was there. She stood close to Daniela, the two of them having become, in the months since the hearing, the kind of friends forged by shared experience and the specific closeness of people who had been afraid of the same thing and had chosen differently. Cody was there, in the back, slightly apart from the main group, in the specific position of someone who belongs somewhere and is still getting used to the fact that he belongs there. He had cut his hair. He was wearing a shirt without holes in it. Small things. Things that mattered in the way small things do when they represent larger shifts. Haley stood at the front of the gathering and looked at the collected people and felt the weight of it in a way she couldn't have accessed a year ago. Not because she'd been harder then, she had been hard, precise, efficient, the necessary hardness of a person who needs those qualities to survive. But she hadn't had enough yet. Enough evidence that the specific combination of effort and honesty and refusing to stop could accrue into something you were allowed to stand in the middle of and say, this is real and it belongs to all of us. She had it now. Bear spoke first. He did not use notes. He stood with his cane at his side, and his voice had the particular quality of someone speaking without performance No rhetorical architecture, no calculated pauses, just a man saying what was true. He said that a year ago, he had walked into a diner and his heart had failed, and a young woman he had never met had gotten on the floor beside him and refused to stop. He said that in 29 years of riding, he had learned many things about what brotherhood meant, but that what it meant at the most basic level was that you showed up for the person next to you. You showed up without conditions, and you kept showing up even when they told you they didn't need it. Because sometimes need and want were different things. And sometimes the right kind of showing up was just making yourself visible so the other person knew the option existed. He said that Haley Monroe had saved his life on a diner floor. And then she had taken the second chance that it created for her and used it to build something that would save other lives in ways neither of them had anticipated. And that was what second chances were supposed to be for. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The people around them were quiet in the particular way of people who understand they are inside a real moment and do not want to interrupt it. "Thank you," Bear said to her. Directly, simply, the two words carrying the full weight of everything that had happened in the 12 months between the diner floor and this afternoon. She stepped forward. She had prepared remarks. She had them in the notebook, organized, complete, with the clean logical sequence she brought to everything. She looked at the gathered faces: Bear, Grizz, Roy, Derek, Cody, Daniela, Samantha, Arthur Vance in his tie, Garcia, Linda, the nurses, the strangers who had become known, and she put the notebook in her jacket pocket. She would say what was true. That was always sufficient. She said, "A year ago, I was sleeping under an overpass with $63 and a dead phone. I want to say that plainly because I think the specific reality of it matters, not to make it dramatic, but because what happened after it is only meaningful if you understand what it started from." She paused. "The thing that changed my life was not the motorcycles. I know that's not the expected thing to say here, and I mean no disrespect by it. The motorcycles were visible, and they were powerful, and they mattered. But the thing that changed my life was a specific phone call. A man in a hospital bed who I had known for 45 minutes, who had nearly died on the floor next to me, getting on the phone and asking whether I was all right before he asked about anything else. Not what I needed, not what he could do, whether I was all right. Like my answer was the starting point, not his offer." She looked at Bear. "That's the difference," she said, "between help that rescues and help that restores. Rescuing takes over. Restoring hands you the tools and trusts you to build. Every person in this program needs the second kind. Every person I have ever met who was in my situation needed the second kind. And almost none of us get it, because the second kind is harder. It takes longer. It requires you to trust the person you're helping even before they've proved everything. And most of the time, the world doesn't have the patience for that." She looked out at the gathered faces. "The Monroe Roadside Rescue Program exists to have that patience," she said. "My mother was a paramedic. She said the hardest thing about the job wasn't the emergencies. It was watching people fall through cracks that didn't have to exist. She spent 11 years trying to get to people faster. This program is my version of that. We're going to get to people faster. We're going to see the window before it closes, and we are going to hand people the tools and then get out of the way and let them use them." She stopped. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was the full, textured silence of people absorbing something real. Then Cody clapped. One pair of hands from the back of the group, the slightly awkward, entirely genuine applause of a young man who had never been a public applause person and was doing it anyway. Daniela joined him, and then Samantha, and then it moved through the crowd, the same way the slow applause on the courthouse steps had moved the deliberate rhythm of people choosing to mean it. Haley stood in the middle of it and did not deflect. The gathering wound down in the way good ones do, slowly, in pieces, people finding each other and staying in conversation longer than they'd planned. Arthur Vance found her near the coffee station and shook her hand with both of his and said, "Your mother would be very proud." She thanked him and held on to the words, held them carefully, the way you hold things you intend to keep. Derek found her afterward. He stood in front of her with the particular expression she'd learned to read as his version of something personal, the held-back quality of a man who feels things at full intensity and has spent decades not saying so. "The program," he said. "If you need someone to run the mechanical curriculum, on Tuesday mornings I'm available." She looked at him. "What happened to your standing Thursday shift with your daughter?" He blinked. He hadn't expected her to know about the Thursday shift. "It moved to Sunday," he said, slightly off balance. "She joined a volleyball league." "Tuesday mornings work," Haley said. "Come in at 8. I'll have the curriculum outline ready." He nodded once. Something in his posture eased the almost imperceptible release of a man who has been carrying an unresolved thing and has just set it down. "Good work," he said. And then, before she could respond, he walked away with the brisk efficiency of a man returning to a level of emotional comfort he was more familiar with. She watched him go. Roy materialized beside her with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without asking. She took it. "You're building something real," Roy said. "We're building something real," she said. He considered the correction, accepted it with a nod. They drank their coffee in the comfortable silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill space. 6 weeks after the ceremony, on a Saturday night in late July, her radio crackled. She was 3 weeks into her weekend shifts with the ambulance service by then, working with a paramedic named Tomas, who had 20 years on the job and the specific economy of motion that came with it. They had developed an easy working rhythm. He ran primary. She ran support. And in the cases where circumstances moved faster than the conventional hierarchy, they both moved without stopping to negotiate it, which was the sign of 2 people who trusted each other's judgment. The call came at 11:17. Vehicle collision on the highway north of the city. Multiple vehicles. Unknown injuries. She was running before Tomas finished reading the call. They reached the scene in 9 minutes. 2 motorcycles down. A car with front-end damage. 3 people on the ground. 1 walking, 1 not moving. She went to the one not moving. He was a man in his 50s, not someone she recognized. Not someone from any world she knew. Just a man who had been on the highway on a Saturday night and was now on the ground with a head wound and a breathing pattern that told her everything she needed to know about the next 2 minutes. She went to work. The sequence was the same sequence. It had always been the one her mother had named for her. The one she'd run on a diner floor a year and a half ago. The one she'd building toward her entire adult life without knowing the specific shape it would take. Assessment, airway, circulation, communication, present, focused, exact, not performing calm, actually calm. The calm of a person who has trained for this and trusts the training. Tomas was at the second patient. She heard him working and did not look up. She stayed with the man on the ground and talked to him and managed the bleed and called the status back to Tomas in the clean, sequential language of a handoff, and she stayed present in every second of it the way her mother had always stayed present. Not ahead of the moment, not behind it, inside it, because that was where the work was. The ambulance from the next station arrived 11 minutes later. She gave the handoff. Thorough, precise. Everything the receiving team needed, and nothing extra. She stepped back. The man was loaded. The ambulance cleared the scene. She stood on the highway shoulder and breathed. Tomas came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. They had enough of a rhythm by now that he understood when she needed a moment and when she needed him to check in, and he read it correctly. "Good work," he said, eventually. "He's going to be all right," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably," Tomas said, which was the most an experienced paramedic ever said with certainty about anything. She understood the language by now. She looked at the highway. In the distance, headlights were coming, not emergency vehicles, just traffic resuming as the scene cleared. The ordinary movement of people going places, unaware of what had just happened on this particular stretch of road. She heard motorcycles. She turned. Bear was there, and Grizz and 3 other riders pulled over at the shoulder 50 yards back, not close enough to interfere, not far enough to miss anything. They had been monitoring the scanner, which she had not known until that moment. which was something she would have words about later, though not serious words, because she understood what it meant and why he did it and did not entirely object. Bear raised his hand, just that. One hand from 50 yards, in the dark. She raised hers back. Tomas looked between her and the distant cluster of bikes. He said, "Friends of yours?" "Something like that," she said. He accepted this without further inquiry, which she appreciated. She walked back to the ambulance. She climbed in. She picked up the radio for the next call. She thought about her mother, about the kitchen table, and the long shifts and the specific way her mother had moved through the world, not in spite of difficulty, but straight through it, with the patient conviction of someone who believed that showing up was the most important thing. That being present for the person in front of you, fully present, was the one contribution nobody could take from you regardless of what else they removed. She thought about the overpass and the $63 and the notebook with its busted zipper. She thought about the key in her pocket, her mother's motorcycle, restored by the hands of people who had decided, separately and then together, that a thing worth finding was worth fixing. She thought about Cody arriving at 6:52 on a Monday morning, and the way his voice had changed when he started talking about engines. She thought about all of it, the whole accumulated chain of it, each link holding the next. And she felt not the heavy nostalgia of looking backward, but the clean, directed energy of someone who knows where they came from and exactly where they are going. The radio crackled again. She answered it. Behind her, on the desert highway, Bear and his riders pulled back onto the road, not following her, moving in the same direction, letting her lead. That was the story of Haley Monroe, a 20-year-old woman who saved a life she was never asked to save, who lost everything for doing it, who refused to stay lost, who built something real and lasting from the ground of a borrowed blazer and her mother's notebook and a key that was always hers to begin with. She had not been rescued. She had been seen, and she had done the rest herself.